Alright, well, if you've seen some of the videos out on the channel, I've been going through trying to see about these single carb intakes. Now, I kind of like the dual carbs because I can adjust them individually. They tune for the bike well, and I don't have an issue with tuning the things. But some folks are getting tired of these dual carbs and they want to go to a single carb. So I decided I was going to look at the options because there's quite a few different designs out for these single carb intakes. Now, this is one I got from a parts bike. And we tested it in the other video, and I could make the bike run with it, but it seemed like the cylinders were kind of fighting each other, and the motor was really loud. It did increase its bottom end torque, but didn't do much else. So this is not a very good design. This one that I made with an equal length runner, this one turned out to be the worst of all, because for some reason that rear cylinder tends to want to steal the fuel away from the front. So the rear cylinder was fine, but the front cylinder was running so lean that it wouldn't even run the bike. So I couldn't even fully test this one, and it turned out that that is definitely not a design way to go. Well, come to find out, there's a guy, and you can probably look him up on the Facebook forum. It's Yamaha Nation, all things, Yamaha Virago, something like that. I'll put a link up there to it. But his name is Adam Smith, and he's actually been making some of these. So he saw the videos and he sent me a message and he said, hey, let me send you one of mine. He said, you can put it on your test rig and see what it does. So today what we're going to be looking at is putting Adam Smith's single carb manifold on the test rig, just like we did the other ones. And we're going to see how well this one does for balancing the air fuel mix between the rear and the front cylinders with a single carb. Now the carb I'm going to be using is the same one I did in the other test. It's a single of the first gen Hitachi carburetor. So this is a 40 millimeter. It's just one of the two duals. That way I can kind of keep things consistent, and I'll be able to use it to test on here because it fits up to most of these single carb intakes. So we're going to put this guy on here on our test rig here in just a minute, and we're going to see how Adam Smith's single carb intake does. Alright, so over to the test rig. And in case you hadn't seen the videos on the little test rig here, this is a first gen 750 motor, and I equipped it with some oxygen sensors on the front and rear pipes, as well as an air fuel ratio gauge. I got vacuum gauges to check both carburetors. We got our regular gauges up here to see RPMs, things like that, and also installed two temperature gauges on the exhaust so we can see what's going on with this motor. Got a little gas thing up there so we can run some gas down to it, and away we'll go. But before we take our duals off and put the single carb intake that Adam made on here to check it, what we're going to do is verify the motor is in good shape and we're getting good readings and everything. That way we know everything's good, and when I swap it out, I'll have a good baseline for whether or not it's going to work right. So we'll set the camera back up on the stand here and we'll fire this up. Then I'll bring it over and I'll show you that the air fuel slowly dials in as the motor warms up, and you can see the settings that I'm running, where I'm running a little bit rich in the back like I like it, and it's a little bit under 14, 12 to 13, something like that for an air-cooled motor. So we're in good shape not to overheat our little motor here. Alright, so let's get this guy fired up. I'll bring the camera over here and we'll watch these gauges. And also forgot to mention that I installed something on here, which is a power steering pump, that loads the motor down, so when I put it in gear I can simulate motor load to see how well it reacts when you give it throttle. It's not just freewheeling the motor. We can torque it down and give it a little bit of load, kind of like a dyno. So let's get this thing fired up, get our fuel turned on, and let's fire him up. Alright, so as you can see, the air fuel readings are coming in a little bit high because it's cold, but as the motor warms up, you'll see those numbers start dropping down. We'll get into the target range. So the B, you can read the little info. The upper one is the rear, and the lower one is the front. So with the other single carb intakes, what would happen is I could get the rear cylinder to come in and be okay on its AFR, but the front cylinder was always running really lean, like up in the 17. You can see right here we're in pretty good shape. As the motor warms up, those numbers will stabilize a little bit and everything looks good. So for the dual carbs, you can see my vacuums are in line. Everything looks good. I'm idling at about 1,000. So that's where I need to be. And you can see my temperatures on the exhaust are low right now, but when I rev it up, those numbers will come up. So now we're coming on into our range on our air fuel mix. So, looks like my test rig is still really healthy, and I'm running the dual carbs right now. So now, what I need to do is swap these dual carbs out for Adam's single, and we're going to do this very same test, and we're going to see how well it does. But you can hear with the dual carbs, and I got a Jardine exhaust on it, so it's a little bit loud, but with the dual carbs on it, the motor sounds really smooth, really stable, and we'll be able to compare that once we put the single carb on. Alright, so with the test rig verified, we're going to take these duals off real quick, and we're going to install that single carb intake that we got from Adam, and we will just see how it does. I'm also, once I get these off, I'll also show whether or not it installed real good, because that's another big question. I really struggled with one of those trying to get it to seal up because it just wasn't made quite right. So we'll also look at that once we get these off and do the install, and we'll be able to see how well that one does on its installation. So with our dual carbs removed, now we can put the single carb on and see just what it's about. Alright, so for the initial fit up here, I'm going to check it without any gaskets, and we can see that it looks like if I hold it against one side, it'll have a little bit of gap over here. So that's good. It's got a little bit of freedom to move. Now these things don't flex much because there's not much area to flex. So what I'm going to do is actually use a cork-backed gasket. So this is a regular gasket, and then I got a cork backer on it. What that's going to do is get it a little bit thicker, and the cork is squishy, and so it's going to be able to tighten up against that and seal off. Now we're going to check it after we install it. We'll put some air in here with the vacuum cleaner in reverse, and then we're going to spray for bubbles, and we're going to check and make sure it's all sealed up before we do any testing. But this will help us to make sure we get a good seal on our cylinders right there and take up a little bit of that space. So we'll get this thing installed here, and then we'll be able to check it and make sure it's not leaking. Alright, so we got the single carb intake installed. Wasn't too bad, about like the other ones. You really got to play around with the gaskets and get the thickness just right. And like I say, I'm using cork because I don't want to put RTV on my test rig, because I'll just have to get all that stuff back off there. But good thing about cork is that it's squishy, and also if I have any leaks, I can just spray some water on it. It'll expand a little bit and it'll seal up. Then I can put a little RTV right around the edge of it, and I can get that back off. So the very next step we got to do in making sure everything is right on this install here is to check for leaks. Now this is one of the most important things you got to do on these single carb intakes I've found, is that you got to make sure you don't have any leaks. So what you need to get is like a shop vac and put it in on the reverse port so it's blowing. And then what we're going to do is hook that up to where the carburetor goes. And I'm not going to hook it into the machine, I'm just going to hold it. And then I'm going to spray some soapy bubbles around and make sure my seals are good. So we'll just hold this up kind of toward it, and then I'll pull it in as I spray the bubbles on it and look for bubbles. Alright, so right around back, right around here, I got the tiniest little group of bubbles coming out where it's not sealing up against that cork. So let me get the camera around here and I'll show you. So right here on the back side of this one, you can see right there the remnants of the little tiny bubbles where I was blowing air in there. So that's why it's really important to put some air into the intake manifold and just make sure you're not leaking. Alright, so with our little leak fixed on the back side with some RTV, and we got our single carb Hitachi This is a 40 millimeter off of first gen. It's on our Adams single carb intake right there. So we're ready to fire this thing up and see what it do. Alright, so I'm still using the about 150 on the main, and I got like a 43 on the idle. And so we're at the same settings we were for those other single carb intakes. So now let's see. I'll try it with the choke off, and we'll give her some gas here and see what she does. Not too bad. Started up off choke. Looks like that's hitting on both. Let's wait a minute for these gauges right here to come on and see what it's doing. Let's drop it up a bit. On our vacuum, and if we look at our air fuel, we're actually running a little bit rich on the rear, but we're well in line on the front, and that's with the choke off. So that actually looks really good. Looks like this intake is much more balanced. I rev it up. Yeah, so it looks like this single carb intake here from Adam is a whole lot closer to being able to balance those carbs, because I'm running rich on both of them with that 150 or so on that main. And it idles a little bit rough, but that's probably just some adjustments on the jetting and the needle height and probably the air fuel mix on the idle circuit. But it does level those cylinders out really well. So all I got to do now, because that looks like that's going to work pretty good for that single carb intake, I'm just going to set the camera back down and we'll do a running test. I'll put it in gear over here and we'll load it down and see if that motor will lift up and accelerate like it ought to. Alright, so for the last little test on this single carb intake right here versus the others, I'm going to fire it up and then I'm going to engage the load here on my power steering pump, and we're going to see how well it throttles up. So let's get it fired back up here. And there we go. Well, it looks like that intake is much better balanced. Like I say, I'm a little bit rich on both cylinders right now, but that's not a big worry because all I got to do is play with the jetting on it. The biggest problem with those other single carb intakes that I was messing with is that it imbalanced them so bad. So as we can see from Adam's design here, looks like he's pretty close. You could actually work with that. The motor's got plenty of good throttle up. It ran the power steering pump real easy, throttled right up. A little rougher on the idle, but that's probably to be expected because you can't balance those two cylinders exactly like you can with dual carbs. But the noise sounded pretty good. I mean, it was revved up good, a little bit louder, but everything ran really well. So there you go, Adam. Looks like you got a pretty good design compared to the other ones that I tested before. Well, alrighty. Well, thanks for watching.